not sure the microphone is working that well. Fortunately, I am extremely loud. Yeah. Perhaps. All right. Thank you all for coming out here tonight to another in Newton for Everyone series of educational events. We're really grateful for you all coming out, both everyone here in the room and also everybody on the Zoom online. In case you're not familiar with us here at Newton for Everyone, we are a pro-housing organization here in Newton advocating for a diverse array of housing opportunities for people of all ages, means, and backgrounds to be able to live here in this city. And we are here tonight to talk about our schools here in Newton and the educators that make them great. The greater Newton community values education very deeply. Young families move here for our schools. They move here for our excellent special education program, for the NECP, which is an amazing preschool and a marvel of inclusive education, all the way through to our high schools, which rank top in the country every year. Our older families all have fond memories of their favorite traditions in the schools and of teachers and educators who made strong differences for their kids. But those schools are nothing without the educators who come in and work in them every day, teaching, nurturing, and educating our kids. Unfortunately, as we'll hear from our speakers tonight, the housing shortage, which affects the entire Boston region and Newton as well, is making it harder for these educators to live in or even near to Newton. My daughter's kindergarten teacher, the wonderful Miss McSwiggan of Horace Mann, commutes in every day from Rhode Island. And I'm humbled by her dedication to her students. She's even coming to the after-school events, and I remember seeing her at the Day After Day Wizard of Oz performance, which was great. Highly recommend checking that out if you're into amateur juvenile theater every year. But she stays there until 8:30, giving my daughter a hug, and then I know she's getting on the road to drive all the way back down to another state at the end of the night. And I just wish she and so many of our educators didn't have to deal with long commutes and the burden of high cost of housing. But fortunately, we have the perfect guests with us here tonight to discuss this issue and the challenges that our educators face. First, we'll be hearing from Heather Peske, who's the president at the National Council on Teacher Quality. She'll be presenting her organization's research on housing costs and teacher compensation, lay out the implications of the housing shortage on the retention and recruitment of high-quality teachers, and the impacts that has on the educational system and its ability to deliver quality education. Then we'll hear from Ari Kenyon Vance, who is a counselor, coach, and educator at Newton South, and her personal experience in trying to find housing near our schools to sort of better understand what this crisis means for individual educators and their families. So that's the program for tonight. Heather, please come take it away.
I'm a former elementary teacher, so standing behind a lectern is a little bit strange, but I'll do my best. First of all, good evening. It's so great that you all came out, especially those of you who are conflicted because you're thinking right now about the Red Sox and the Yankees. So hopefully the Sox will prevail. I'm sure it'll be a very long night, so you will certainly be able to catch some of the game after you leave tonight. I'm Heather, and I lead the National Council on Teacher Quality, and I'm going to share with you some of our findings. But before I do, I just also have to acknowledge my own teacher and mentor is in the audience. Susan Moore Johnson is sitting here in the second row. She lives in Newton, and she's a retired faculty member from the Harvard Grad School of Education. So the reason I'm standing here is because Susan is sitting there and has stood behind me for many, many years. So I just want to say thank you publicly for that. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to get into our discussion about what we found and what we looked at, and then we have a lot of time for questions. So I have about 13 slides. I will share them with you, and then I will give you plenty of time for questions. And I think, Josh, you're monitoring the chat maybe. So yes, Josh will be monitoring the chat. So friends at home, you can feel free to chime in as well. So first of all, some of you may be thinking, well, what is the National Council on Teacher Quality? Just very quickly, we're a national nonprofit, a nonpartisan research and advocacy organization, and we're trying to impact states, districts, and teacher preparation programs who are the main actors that have the most influence in helping us to meet our mission. And much like our name, our mission is to ensure that every child has access to a quality teacher and every teacher is supported to be able to be quality and effective for kids. And so part of the reason that we looked at housing and the cost of housing in comparison to teacher salaries is because of the tension and the challenge of recruiting and retaining great teachers, particularly when salaries are not meeting the cost of housing. So let me get into the findings and share a little bit. We did this analysis back in May. We published an analysis, and by we, I'm using that very liberally. My colleague, Dr. Catherine Bowser, did this analysis, and so she's really the brains behind it. I just come and share the findings with you. So if you have other questions, I'm happy to introduce you to Catherine if you're really a detailed person who wants to know more about the methods, and just want to acknowledge her. So in May, we published this analysis where we looked across the nation at 70 districts across the US. We analyzed teacher salary compared to housing costs in those 70 districts across the US. Boston is one of those districts, so I'll reference that tonight. But that's how the folks who invited me, and I give thanks to Luke and Josh and Carol, I'm not sure, there you are, and thank you for inviting me. They saw the paper that we produced and invited me to come and speak about Newton. So in response, I immediately asked Catherine, I said, listen, you know, these great folks in Newton, and by the way, I live in Arlington, so it was also really fun to be asked to come to a town right near my own with similar challenges around housing and salaries. So I asked Catherine if she'd be willing to do a more specific analysis. So that's what I'm going to share with you today, is the specific analysis focused on Newton. I thought that would just obviously be much more meaningful than just our analysis on Boston, given the differences in the towns. So without further throat clearing, as our colleague Richard Elmore used to say, I will get into through 2024-25, which is when we had the most recent data available. And so that's where the salary data comes from. And for those of you who aren't familiar with education speak, and I'll try not to do too much of it, a CBA is a collective bargaining agreement. That's the teacher's contract. You've heard a lot about this in Newton in the last few years. And so that's the contract that governs and sets the salary schedule, which is the document that determines the salaries for each teacher by each year that they're working in the Newton district. We looked at rental data from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we used Zillow for the data on housing prices and estimates of total monthly payment and things like that. And then the inflation data comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. I do want to note one thing, again, for those of you not so familiar with what we call salary schedules, which is what determines teacher compensation in districts that have collective bargaining. There's a difference between a teacher who has a bachelor's degree and a teacher who has a master's degree. You're paid more for the master's degree, and you're paid by what we call steps. Each year that you have experience, you get a little bit more money in your salary. So those numbers will show up tonight, and you'll see me kind of reference the differences. It's not that much, but for those of you who are detail-oriented, I know that you might be wondering, what's the difference here between the bachelor's and the master's? So I just wanted to preview that for you. Okay, let's see. Here's the first graph, and I'll explain it. We looked to see what does it look like in Newton Public Schools for first-year novice teachers in terms of their salaries compared to housing costs. And so the big takeaway here is that salary growth is being outpaced by inflation, by home prices, and by rental prices. So let me talk a little bit more specifically. If you look here at this data, what you see is that we looked at the growth in teacher salaries for first-year teachers compared to housing costs. Now, the good news is that, that in Newton, in the last 5 years, we see that the average salaries for first-year teachers, for novice teachers, grew at about 20%. So that's good news. But the bad news is the cost of housing increased. So between 2020 and 2025, the last 5 years, home prices increased by about 40%. And rental prices grew by about 20%. You see that red line there until 2024, when rental prices have started to decelerate a little bit. But even so, the growth outpaced teacher salaries on average. And so between 2020 and 2025, the average teacher salaries for novice teachers what grew at about 20%. So what we see is that there's this widening gap. The big picture here for this graph is that there's this widening gap. So even though teacher salaries are increasing, the good news, the amount of purchasing power that teachers have is shrinking. So there are these growing disparities. And this was a problem even before 2020. We just focused on the last 5 years because we were curious to see if it has grown worse, and indeed it has. Now, this, I promised you, is the other districts in our sample. Let me just get my list because I'm going to forget one of them if I don't tell you who they are. Yes. So this is a local sample of 8 surrounding districts around Newton. It includes Needham, Brookline, Wellesley, Weston, Waltham, Watertown, Newton, and Boston Public Schools. And so I asked Catherine to do this analysis and look at it because I thought you'd be interested to see, well, where does Newton sit in comparison to these other areas? And it's the same, you can see the graph is pretty much the same picture here. So what you see is that, again, housing prices increased. In this 8-district sample, it was a little bit less. The average home prices increased by 37%. Newton, you'll recall, was by 40%. Rental costs grew by about 20%. And inflation stayed, it's the same, of course, in both graphs at 23%. And then, again, the average salaries for novice teachers across the 8 districts grew at about 15%. So here again, close observers will note that Newton salaries grew more, 19 to 20%, compared to the 8-district sample of 15%. But still, and Susan, who's a scholar of teachers, would tell you and has long studied collective bargaining and teacher compensation, among many other things, that it's good news that teachers' salaries have increased. And they've increased quite a lot, and yet they're just not keeping pace with the cost of housing, both buying a house and rental costs. So we have a good news story, but then we have a worse story, which results in the importance of an event like this, where we can try to figure out some solutions. So again, the takeaway is that salary growth is really being outpaced by inflation, by rental, and by home costs. All right, so if you look at this, this is about renting. And what we see, we looked at this question of can novice teachers, again, first-year teachers, can they afford a 1-bedroom apartment to rent in any of these local districts? And the answer is no. Now, when some of you are saying, well, Heather, what does affordable mean? It means that you're not paying more than 30% of your salary, your gross salary, on housing. And so you can see that the percent of salaries needed for renting a 1-bedroom in all of these districts, including this town of Newton, well outpaces that 30% affordability threshold. And so you can see that in each of the districts, a 1-bedroom apartment is unaffordable for novice teachers, regardless of whether they have a bachelor's or a master's degree. It's a little more affordable if they have a master's, but really not by much. And also, we didn't show this in this chart, but I asked Catherine about this, and a 1-bedroom apartment is also unaffordable for teachers who have 5 years of experience. So you might say, well, their first year, they could live with a bunch of other teachers, or maybe they live at home. Maybe some of you are actually housing a teacher right now who is your child who's living at home. But still, after 5 years, it was still unaffordable. And you can see really there, we're asking these first-year teachers, if you look at Newton, we're asking them to spend almost half of their salary to rent a 1-bedroom apartment. So people often say to me, well, Heather, so what do people do when they can't afford to rent a house or rent an apartment or buy a house? And the answer to that is mixed. I mean, as I just mentioned, some people live with family members. Other people take on many roommates. Still others really endure quite a long commute as they set out to live in Massachusetts in a town that's more affordable. But since we all live here, we well know that more affordable is relative, and it means further and further away from where they're teaching. And so there, too, the impact of a really long commute, the research shows us a number of things. First of all, teachers are more likely to be absent. Not surprisingly, if you have a really long commute, it may be more difficult for you to get to your job. They also, some studies have shown that they have lower observation scores, which I don't think has much to do necessarily with their effectiveness, but rather probably their exhaustion from having to travel so far. They're less knitted into the fabric of the community. I mean, when I was teaching elementary school many years ago, I would run into students and their parents at the grocery store. Those of you who are or have been teachers know this is an astonishing occurrence for a child who's like, Miss Peske, you buy groceries? And it's kind of this wonderful moment where you realize like you are part of this community and children see you in a different way than when you're in the classroom. Furthermore, the teachers who live further away who have longer commutes are more likely to leave the classroom, kind of not surprisingly, and certainly more likely to leave the district that they're in, perpetuating a revolving door and continued vacancies in your schools and in the town. So let me ask you, what do you think a teacher would need to earn as an annual salary in order to be able to afford rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Newton? Any guesses out there? This is when you all get shy. What do you think? Go ahead, call out some numbers. 120 to rent a one-bedroom? 95? Any other guesses? 150? To be able to afford a one-bedroom, it's about $91,000 that you would need to earn as a minimum salary for your rent to be able to be affordable. Again, some of you may be saying, wow, 30% is still a really high proportion of one's income to be able to afford housing. And you can see there the current starting salary. And the range, again, is because of bachelor's degrees versus master's degrees. Now, I want to show you, so I talked about the fact that teacher salaries have gone up. And so what we see here is that Newton teachers do gain purchasing power in the housing and rental market in their first 5 years, but rent is still unaffordable. So this graph is a little bit different than what you saw before. So imagine that you're a current teacher who's just started a job in Newton. This is September. Well, we're almost at October, but you've been here about a month, a little over a month. And going through the first 5 years of your career. This graph shows what happened in teacher salaries for teachers from that first year on the job to having 5 years of experience under their belt. So this includes salary increases from things like cost of living adjustments and raises, the step raises based on experience. So this shows the trajectory for the 2020 teacher cohort in Newton, meaning a teacher who started in 2019-2020 and got 5 years of experience by last academic year, 24-25. So what we see is that housing prices increased in Newton by about 40%. You see that, 39.7%. Rent increased by about 20%. Inflation, again, was at 23%. And Newton salaries increased for teachers with master's degrees and bachelor's. It's about the same for the first 5 years by 44%. So this is really good news. And it's counter to what we found when we did our national analysis, the one that I mentioned earlier. Nationally, teachers' purchasing power decreased in their first 5 years on average. So their dollars were worth less in the housing market in their 5th year of teaching than they were in their first year of teaching because the housing costs grew at such a fast rate. That's the national story. In contrast, here in Newton, teachers gained purchasing power in the housing and rental market. But before everyone gets pleased or we lull ourselves into thinking that teachers are going to be okay with housing, look at the little box to the right, which says that it doesn't mean that the teachers can afford rent. It's still unaffordable for teachers with 5 years of experience. A one-bedroom apartment in Newton is about 35 to 38% of a teacher's salary, depending upon whether they have a master's degree or a bachelor's degree. So again, it's a good news story that the salaries have increased, and it's a tough story overall in that their purchasing power has really not. This is the 8-district sample. Here again, we see that this is the same story where we looked at teachers who started teaching in 2019, 2020, and got to 5 years of experience by last year. Home prices increased on average across these 5 towns a little bit less, by about 37%. Rent was about the same, and inflation obviously is the same. And here, teacher salaries in this cohort grew by about 45 to 46%. So again, this is good news, and it's counter to what we found in the national analysis. But we have the same warning here, where housing costs are still outpacing teacher salary increases. So this goes to the question of you imagining that you're a 25-year veteran teacher. So perhaps you've taught multiple generations of students. I have two girls in the Arlington Public Schools. My second daughter is always lamenting that she has to be Lila's sister. So imagine that, that's in one family, of course, but imagine if they'd also taught me. So you might be a teacher with 25 years of experience who's taught multiple generations of families. You're very invested in Newton and in the Newton Public Schools. By the way, I will say to you all, we're also going to share the slides. It's totally fine to take photos with your cameras, but I should have mentioned that at the start. We'll share them and have them. And I have all these notes in the slide deck so that you don't have to interpret for yourselves. I mean, you're welcome to, but we have a lot of notes too. So we're asking new teachers to live with these difficulties and these challenges of being able to afford a house. But we're also asking Newton's most experienced teachers to pay more than half of their salaries for a mortgage. And this assumes that they were able to scrape together 20% in a down payment, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. So we asked the question, if a teacher could save 10% of their gross pay annually, which is pretty ambitious. I mean, ask yourself, did you save last year 10% of your annual gross pay? Maybe you did, maybe not. We estimated, again, using kind of back of the envelope calculations, that it would take 29 to 32 years to be able to save 20% for a down payment. I mean, can you imagine telling someone who's starting out at 22 years old, you're going to be able to have a house, but it's going to take you until you're in your 50s to be able to do that. And by the way, we couldn't calculate we didn't use a model that predicted even higher rates of increase of housing costs. And that's with being able to save 20% for a down payment. So on average, as you can see there, we looked at, in Newton as well as the surrounding towns, what percent of the salary would be needed to be able to afford a monthly housing payment? And you can see those numbers are pretty staggering in terms of looking at teachers either with a bachelor's or a master's degree. In Newton, it's 53% if you have just a bachelor's. If you happen to have a master's, which, by the way, costs a lot of money to attain, you would have to spend 48% of your salary. So what do you estimate now the minimum salary requirement would be for a teacher to be able to afford a monthly home payment here in Newton? Remember, it was $91,000 for rent. What do you think it would be if we said, what would the minimum threshold of salary be to be able to afford a monthly housing payment? What are some guesses? 250? 210? That's pretty close. The answer is $183,000. So for teachers with 25 years of experience, we're saying that if we assume their base salary, which again we looked up using the contract, we would say that it would cost $183,000 for a teacher to be able to afford a monthly house payment, again with the affordability threshold at 30%. And you can see there what teachers in Newton currently earn with 25 years of experience, with a really big difference between $69,000 and $80,000. So the question now is, and this I know that Luke and Josh and Carol want to facilitate more conversation, which is great. But a colleague of mine said succinctly, this is my colleague Chad Alderman, and he said, I quote, "The teacher housing problem is largely a generic community-wide affordability problem that will be solved only by building more housing units." So sometimes people will say, well, what can we do? And I don't want to leave you feeling paralyzed. There are certainly a number of options, and this again is where I hope we generate more discussion. So I put forward a few ideas. The first is Bentonville Teacher Homes Project. I will note, if any of you have been to Bentonville, Arkansas, it's very different. It's a really different place than Newton or Arlington, my town, or this area. So Luke did caution me that I cannot go too long into this example because it's a really different context. Bentonville, for those of you who don't know, is where the headquarters of Walmart is, and the company has invested a great deal in that city. It's had huge growth. They have all these requirements about living there, and they subsidize a lot of the activities of the city, including this project. But I did want to mention it just to have an imagination in your mind about one possibility. This Bentonville Teacher Homes Project is a 160-unit affordable housing development that comprises 40 single-family cottages and 120 multifamily units that is designed to house teachers, staff, and other residents of the Bentonville School District. So it's really specifically designed as a place that provides housing for the staff of the Bentonville, Arkansas schools. Now, sometimes when I've talked to reporters, Sienna, I don't know if you would have this question. Sienna's a local reporter. They've asked me, well, Heather, do you think districts should build schools? I'm sorry, do you think districts should build houses? And I know that some districts have entered into this. Miami-Dade Public Schools is one of them, where they've repurposed some of their school buildings in order to build houses. The answer to that is no from me, because districts aren't in the business of being contractors, of figuring out how to build housing. And frankly, this is a lecture for another day, an engagement for another day. Districts aren't doing a great job right now in terms of our student outcomes. So they still need to focus a lot of effort on the work of teaching and learning and promoting an excellent education in the school district. So I think that for districts to get involved in building housing is kind of a distracting enterprise for an organization that is already very stretched in terms of capacity. And yet some of these districts have felt like they don't have another choice. They have to figure out, what can we do? How can we attract teachers? How can we provide housing for them? And what do we do now? So sometimes there are these school district and local housing authority partnerships. The other thing I would mention, which is an additional idea a friend just sent me recently, is something called Adaptive Commons. It's an organization that's investing in rebuilding what they call forgotten spaces. They're looking at working in partnership between developers and the local towns or cities to identify so-called undervalued real estate assets and develop them into living spaces. So given that we see a lot of declining enrollments, a lot of shrinking populations, particularly in cities, there is this question of, is there the possibility of developing spaces that are currently now not used well or not used at all, and developing them into housing? Again, housing is not my expertise. You all know much more about this than I do, but I offer it as a possibility. So finally, I would say, Chad Alderman, our colleague, followed up to our piece that we wrote in the spring, and he made this really good point that I also wanted to offer, and that is that despite the fact that school districts are not in control of the local housing market, they haven't really helped themselves. And Chad says, quote, "By not turning rising revenues into higher salaries for teachers, what districts have chosen to prioritize instead is a larger education workforce over a better paid one. In turn, that makes it harder for teachers and other school employees to afford housing in the places where they work." So this is a little bit of a side note, but it's an important one, and that is that we've made choices to have smaller class sizes, and in so doing, we have more teachers, and so we can't pay them more because we have to pay more of a quantity of teachers. So that is a deliberate policy choice, and it's a choice about targeting resources. Again, that's perhaps a lecture for another day. So finally, I would just say that this is not just a teacher problem. I know that when we think about essential workers, the term we used just a few years ago that we seem to have abandoned now, it's really a community problem. And we need more houses that more people can afford, both teachers as well as other folks who live in the community. That is it for me, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Say that again? Oh, I'm so sorry. We're going to hear. Okay.
Thank you, Heather. We're going to hear now from Ari, who teaches at South, about her personal experience as an educator looking for housing near the new schools.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Ari Kenyon Vance, and I'm here today to share a little bit of my story being an educator in the district and having recently gone through the housing journey myself. So I began working in Newton in September of 2019 as a guidance counselor at Newton South High School. At that time, I was living in Cambridge with roommates, and over the next 3 years, from 2019 through 2022, I continued to rent and live with roommates. But when 2022 came along and I was 31 years old, I had this dream of owning my own home one day, but the reality was is if I didn't start doing some significant saving, that wasn't going to be a possibility for me. So I made the tough choice and I decided to move home and live with my parents. My parents live in Hanover, so it was quite a commute. I was waking up between 4:30 and 5 o'clock so I could hit the road by 5:30 because I hate traffic. So I could be in Newton by 6:15, but keep in mind the high schools here don't even start until 9 o'clock. So I was spending a lot of time in my office. I was getting work done, but spending a good amount of time before school even started at school. And then I was getting home around 7:30, 8 o'clock, which it is worth noting that my days were super long because I am also a coach. So in addition to being a guidance counselor, I coach 3 seasons. I coach in the fall, winter, and spring, which I love, and that wasn't something I was willing to give up, but that did mean it was long commute, long days for me, but ultimately I was determined to save money for my own home one day, and again, like I love my job and I didn't want to give those parts up. So jump forward to the winter of 2023, my boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband, who's here with me today, we decided to move in together. We are both educators in Newton, and we were lucky enough at that time to move in with his parents who live in Newton, which gave us this really rare opportunity to live in a city that we love and serve. Living in Newton, less than like a 10-minute drive to school, was hugely helpful. It improved our work-life balance and allowed us to dedicate ourselves fully to our work. My husband is a chemistry teacher, I'm a guidance counselor, and we also coach together. So, this was a wonderful opportunity, and because of this, because we were able to save over the last couple of years, we're kind of the lucky ones. Like, we were able to purchase our own home this past summer. Unfortunately, not in Newton, but in a neighboring town that is a manageable commute to school and within our budget. We would have loved to have stayed in Newton. This community means so much to us because of the connections we've built with our colleagues and our students and the families we serve. But even with 2 incomes and 2 educators who have their masters, and with 3 years of savings, it just was not an option for us at this time. I believe that having teachers who live in the community is crucial. It allows educators to be involved more beyond the classroom. As I shared, James and I are coaches, but there's other teachers who are club advisors and they chaperone the school dances. And those roles are really important. They enrich the school culture, they strengthen the connections with students and families. But these roles also require more time and energy. So if the commute is long, it does become difficult for educators, as much as they want to participate and be there for students, to do so. So again, I'm here to really put a face and a story with this topic, and to encourage all of us to think about the policies and investments we may need to support housing for all, especially for our teachers. Affordable housing close to school for teachers isn't just about convenience. It's about also attracting and retaining passionate educators who help our schools thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ari. Great, so now we'll open it up to questions from the group. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll come around with the mic here. Please, we have a large group. Please do keep your questions to under 30 seconds. We've had decent compliance with this over time, but I will wrest the mic from you if I have to. And if you're on the Zoom, you might not be able to hear me, but if you can send a message to Josh, and we will go back and forth and read some questions off the Zoom if we can. Not sure if that's working. But yeah, any questions from the audience?
During the teacher strike, we learned that a lot of people in Newton, it was hard for them to swallow the pill that there was not livable wages for Unit C professionals. And I cannot understand how they would now not understand that this is also a problem. I was with my favorite candidate and neighbor, Mali Broad, in Newton, in one of the village days, and a person came and said, teachers are greedy, teachers are lazy, they get paid too much. and they complain too much, and they don't deliver. So I think we have a problem in the leadership of our city that believes that they can oppose housing for any reason, whether it is historical reasons or conservation or anything else that allows us not to move forward. So what I want to know is information enough? Is providing this data to decision makers enough to make change?
Do you have a thought? Sure.
I think, I forgot your name, I'm sorry. Ari. I think what Ari just did is evidence of the importance of stories and stories accompanying the data. Because I think you just touched a lot of hearts in the room, whereas I hopefully catalyzed some minds. And so I think it's really important that we hear these stories. And I think we can't just depend on teachers to be the ones to always have to tell the stories. I think that we need some allies in that work. And as I mentioned, it's not just teachers, it's other folks, it's nurses, it's healthcare workers, it's the people who work at the fire stations, it's the police, it's all of these people who make up the fabric of our community and provide essential, not just services, but like life-changing work that they're doing. So I really appreciate your bravery and your willingness to share a very personal experience with us, and your congratulations, by the way. But I do think it's important to share both the data and then also the stories. Do you want to add anything, Luke, or are you good?
No, but can you, when we answer, can you just...
Oh, sorry, sure.
Just for the mic, you can just hang out.
Should I hang out?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, other questions?
Hi, Heather, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Avery. I've become really interested. I was a teacher for 4 years, and then I left the profession because I saw an inability to save and do exactly what Ari has done and her husband have done, which, again, congratulations, and seeing like a different path towards homeownership and increasing my savings and paying off my debt. One thing that I have seen, I believe in some research, is some mixed results on teacher pay and its impacts on student achievement. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why this effect of teachers being able to afford where they live and live where they work, why that impact isn't necessarily showing up in the data, since it has such a significant impact on teacher retention, their ability to afford rent and afford to pay off their mortgage. Why, or what do you think the reason is for that? Because I think that I've seen that kind of used as potentially a reason to not increase teacher pay because we don't see direct impacts on student achievement. And just, I'm curious on your thoughts as a policy professional.
Well, I'm self-conscious because Susan has written books about this. So if you want to know more, look up Susan Moore Johnson's writings. So the research on, there are a couple of different ways of thinking about compensation, teacher compensation, and I'll try to keep to your 30-second rule.
Oh,
keep it short.
you could take more than
No, I'm really, because some people in the audience are like, oh, here goes Heather on sort of a mini lecture on compensation. But so some folks have advocated for what is called merit pay, which is, or sometimes it's called pay for performance. So essentially this is paying teachers more for when they generate higher outcomes for students. And outcomes can be measured in various ways. It's usually in terms of pay for performance. It's usually been measured using standardized tests. And so you can debate about whether that's fair or reasonable, but it's a measure that's standardized, it's accessible, it's generally valid and reliable. So pay for performance has been used to pay teachers more when they get better outcomes for students. There's another kind of pay that is called differentiated pay, which is where you could do the pay for performance, or you could do things like where you have shortages, like math teachers, or I think you said chemistry teachers. There are consistent shortages and persistent shortages over many years in certain subjects, and in particular schools. And so some folks have advocated for differentiating pay in order to attract and keep the teachers we need in schools and subjects that have had a hard time attracting people to those schools or those subjects. The research is mixed. The research on performance pay is particularly mixed. Long ago, when I worked for the state, we ran a performance pay program called the Teacher Incentive Fund, and one of the districts was Springfield. And so at one point, I was curious, and so I went out to Springfield and met with a bunch of teachers and asked them about this Teacher Incentive Fund. They had no idea what I was talking about. They said, "Do you mean the Christmas bonus that I get?" And I was like, exactly. So if you're not very clear about what the pay is based on, then you're not motivating behavior, obviously. But when it comes to differentiating, there have been some successes. So for example, the state of Hawaii gave a bonus for teachers who were certified to teach students with disabilities, special ed certified teachers. And they paid $10,000 more per year to teachers who came to teach, who were certified to teach special ed. And in so doing, they reduced their vacancies in special ed by about a third, by 32%, in a very short period of time. So there have been some successes. There have been some programs. Dallas Independent Schools, for example, used performance pay, paying teachers for outcomes based on their teacher evaluation system. And researchers have shown that that did demonstrate an increase in student outcomes. And so the research is a little bit mixed. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, except to say, I think we should look at differentiating teacher compensation. I don't think it makes sense to continue paying based on a salary schedule that's just years of experience and additional master's degrees or doctoral degrees. And we have to be really careful because, as Susan has written, what measures matters, and being very specific about what you're measuring, how you're measuring it, and then linking it to someone's pay is very difficult work to do well. I have a doctorate in education policy. That does not mean I would be more effective as a teacher, and yet on today's current salary schedule, I'm paid much more because of my doctorate. We just published a paper that hasn't got enough attention, so I'm going to brag about it, but focused on master's degrees, what we call the master's degree premium. So the amount of money that districts are spending to pay teachers for a master's degree, those master's degrees are not associated with increases in student outcomes, except in a few cases in secondary schools in math and science. So why we're paying someone like me more money because we have more advanced degrees that are not related to student outcomes is something that we need to question, particularly given your question about the importance of targeting our dollars to really get the best bang for our buck.
Great. We're going to go to a question from the Zoom.
Yep. So one person had a very concrete question. You had equated monthly housing costs with mortgage, but housing costs can also include utilities and insurance and taxes. And they were curious if your research included all those extra costs or is just mortgage costs? And if so, does that make it even harder for teachers?
I think it's a good point. We just have calculated based on monthly mortgage costs, I believe. So the point is very well taken, especially in Massachusetts. If you're talking about January in Massachusetts, affording a monthly payment for your house, it would be quite a lot.
The HUD standard.
Does that include?
Includes all housing-related costs.
Okay, that's very helpful.
Taxes and insurance.
So that's the HUD standard, just to hear it for folks on the Zoom. The HUD standard, this gentleman is saying, does include estimates for other costs, including utilities, among other costs. Thank you.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, you can just
Okay. Just a point of clarification. In Massachusetts, you have to have a master's degree by year 5.
Is that right? That you're required in Massachusetts to get a
Yes.
master's degree? It
Yes.
is right that in some states it is a state requirement that teachers get master's degrees.
Yes, it is. It's a state requirement. Yeah.
Yes. So I think your point is well taken. That in this case, in Massachusetts and in other states that require a master's degree, the audience for this conversation is the state. Because if they're setting that as a requirement, then teachers, of course, in order to stay licensed, have to follow through and get that master's degree.
Yes, and this was a part of the Education Reform Act of 1993 that required this.
And just to be clear, too, subject matter subject knowledge, subject matter content knowledge is very important. It's just that we don't see that show up in student outcomes when it comes to getting a master's degree. So as I said, where we do see it show up is when you're getting a master's at the secondary level in the same content that you're going to be teaching in math and science. So thank you for the point about state policy and the requirements.
We'll go to another question from the Zoom.
I know that Newton is looking at quite a few teacher retirements over the next few years, and retiring teachers have more income, more likely to be able to be living within Newton. Are there other communities you've looked at with similar retirement patterns, and how did that change the makeup of teachers? Is there any
So I guess I'm just trying to understand, is the question, have we looked at other communities that have similar demographics of retiring teachers?
Is this likely going to get worse for a town like Newton as older and higher earning teachers retire? And if so, are there other towns that have had to deal with that kind of changing demographics amongst their educators?
So the demographic shifts in educators, there is a national pattern, but teacher labor markets are very local. I don't know, I don't have a good example of a place. Were you about to jump in, Susan? I don't have an example of another town that has like similar retirement patterns to Newton because I don't know the demographics of Newton teachers.
I think that, there are big patterns. I think that there are big patterns that would affect the whole metropolitan area. As you know, around 2000, there was a big turnover as people my age who'd entered teaching in the 60s or 70s began to retire, and you see that in the numbers. I think that the issue that we're not talking about in the middle of this is the retention issue
Right.
of the relatively less experienced teachers, not novices, but the 7-year teacher, the 8-year teacher. And so, yes, you could redistribute some of that income if you have big retirements. But the cost of having teacher turnover is phenomenal. Both, I mean, the research is really good on this. It's very, very high cost just in bureaucratic kind of advertising for a job, doing, replacing people who stay only 2 or 3 years is a lot. But there's also pretty good research that says that the students pay a price for that.
Right.
So the whole question of, if you leave, how long will it take your department to, bring someone up to speed? Probably can't ever get there, right, to do all that you do. So I think the answer is probably not in redistributing the limited funds that are already being paid to teachers, but really thinking about in a different way about housing or about raising teachers' salaries.
And when Susan says it's very costly, it's like the estimates from the research are thousands of dollars, like $35,000 to $50,000 to replace a teacher.
So I love Newton for Everyone because they run programs like this that remind us that Newton is not for everyone. And what an important thing that is to know. If a very few small tweaks in policy would result in many, 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 many new homes for teachers and for the phlebotomist you saw this morning at Newton Wellesley Hospital who drives farther than you do and then sticks a needle in your arm no matter how tired she is or he is. And Newton could be Newton for everyone, and we don't have to go home from this knowing that our kids will never see their teacher at the grocery store. We need to go home from this, especially during this election season, knowing that people who make policy at the state and local level will change the number of homes we have very quickly.
Please ask a question. please. I keep a list for these events, so you're going to remember for next time.
We actually had a very similar question from the audience, from the Zoom. Right. We had a very similar question from the Zoom. Somebody asked, if we look 10 years into the future at a community that did this right, what's different? What did the city, the school system, and the teachers do together? And the follow-on for this question, to make it complicated, is for those of us in the room who are worried about this or listening who are worried about this, what's like the one thing that we should be doing right now to change the course?
I'll take the first part, and then I'll turn to Luke for the second part. So, as I said, this is not a teacher problem to solve. This is a community problem to solve. Teachers will benefit when there is housing. You will not see teachers having to move to other communities or teachers who had to leave their jobs. So teachers will certainly benefit. But in terms of what to do, this is something that we all need to do something about. And I've been asked before, well, why don't we just raise teacher salaries? Well, that's certainly something that needs to happen, and NCTQ advocates for that. And it's not enough. Because you saw those numbers here, 10 years from now, what I would like to see is that teachers would be able to buy houses in the districts and towns where they work. And so simply raising their salaries isn't enough in order to increase the supply of houses that they would actually be able to buy. Luke, what do you think?
We'll come back. We'll come back to what we can do when we close. But another question.
I might get in trouble here because I don't quite have a question, and somebody just got yelled at for that. But I'll try and add a question at the end. I just wanted to make a clarifying point when we were talking about mortgages, housing mortgages, that the numbers that you put up there included insurance, taxes, and so forth. But even if that's the case, that 183,000 that you had put up there at 30% of gross would put somebody buying a house at somewhere around $640,000 to $660,000, if I'm correct. I don't know about any of you, but if you've seen houses in Newton, they don't go for that much.
Meaning
they go for much, much more. I would be surprised even if you can get a condo at an equivalent cost after an HOA fee. So I just wanted to point that out.
That's even more stark.
That is the bottom level of housing in Newton.
Thank you.
Did you have more? Should I go back?
I think the audience is agreeing.
Yeah, I've got a couple of observations and points. All three of my children went to the Newton schools. Oh, I'm sorry. All three of my children went to the Newton schools. And, well, none of them live in Newton. None of them have ever expressed any desire to live in Newton. But that's their opinion. I personally, I'm a retired school teacher. I'm living on my pension. Very good. I never wanted to live in the town I taught in. If I'm coming out of Garden Remedies, do I really want the parents singing me? Okay. If I remember running into my son's 5th grade teacher at Marty's, and we had a good laugh over it because I told her I understand why. But that's my own personal opinion. I had no desire. Also, as a teacher, I didn't want charity. I want to be able to afford a house. I don't want the nice people to give me one. I taught in the Bronx, okay, not an issue. I taught in Belmont and Sudbury. I didn't want their charity. I wanted salary. And this just perpetuates, I think, charity for teachers. And as I said, it's not something. And pay bumps, having gone through a bitter strike in Belmont many years ago, the last thing I would ever advocate is differential salaries for different subjects. You split the union, and it's just not something you can do, and I just don't think it's a good idea.
Well, this
People on
is,
this- oh,
this
go
is
ahead.
not without controversy. I disagree. I think that you need to put your money where your need is. We can debate that. But I think sir, I agree. Your point is very well taken. I don't think any of us are advocating for charity for teachers. However, when you look at a graph like this and you see the widening gaps, this is just in 5 years, from 2020 to 2025, and there were disparities before that. So I think what we're talking about is such a level of crisis, these widening gaps between what we're paying teachers and the cost of housing, that we have to think about what are the other solutions to this. And certainly teachers and every other professional wants to do their work, they want to do it well, they want to make a difference, and they want to be paid for that, and they want to be able to live with many choices. So whether you decide to live in the community where you teach or live somewhere else, I think you don't want to have to be so constrained by the circumstances that you don't have choice.
This is the last question we have from the Zoom, and I think it actually goes along with your question, which is that the Boston area is made up of these relatively small, relatively homogeneous towns and cities. And these are homogeneous in terms of many things, but including income diversity. Looking across the country, right, is this a common problem, these kind of small towns that each one sets their own policy with regards to housing and with regards to school? How far do other towns decide is too far or not too far for a teacher to drive? And is it reasonable to have the expectation that Newton teachers should live in Newton instead of other towns? And should this extend to other city employees like police or fire?
That's a lot of questions. It is. So Massachusetts has about 385 districts at last count. Maryland, which has about the same number of students, we have about 900,000, 950,000 students, has, I believe it's about 24 districts. So 385 compared to 24 for the same number of students. There are some other places in the country that have these very small districts like we do, but I can't think of very many. Colorado is one of them, but they have a lot of rural districts. Obviously, we have Western Mass, but we're pretty unique in a lot of things, and that number of districts compared to the number of students we're serving is pretty astounding. And when you think about the number of services that a district has to stand up, from HR to payroll to, I don't know, food services, everything, it is not the most efficient of systems. And yet I know in saying that, people are thinking, well, some people may be thinking, well, Heather, but we want our local schools. So I understand that as well. But it is a situation in Massachusetts that is oft debated about this very many number of districts.
I had a clarifying question, an observation first, then a clarifying question. As someone who is in a community where I look around at my peers, I think there are a lot of households where you have both parents who are just working around the clock, trying to pay the bills. And I think that is a level of, one of the things I worry about in Newton is that it is a very difficult place for a single parent. I have heard this from friends who have gone through a divorce, right? How do you live alone on one salary? And so I'm wondering, are your numbers all assuming that the teacher is the sole earner in the household?
Yes. These numbers we didn't account for having a second income in a household.
Yeah.
Which is a very fair critique. And yet, I think going back to this gentleman's point earlier about choice making, I don't think you should, I don't think this should be a patronage profession, meaning that you have to have a patron in order to be able to afford to live in the town where you teach. And I don't think you're arguing for that, but no, we didn't assume that there were two wage earners in the family. So
Yep.
that could soften some of these concerns. But certainly, I think your point is well taken, and I think the discussion earlier tonight shows that we still have a lot of concerns about teachers and being able to afford to live where they live.
Totally.
Are you trying to jump in? There are two wage earners.
Yeah. No, completely.
I mean, actually, I did. Let me see. Is this slide in here? Oh, I thought it's okay. I asked my colleague to pull up the Newton salary schedule because I did want to share with you. But if you look anyway, it's not very high, and even if you multiply it by 2, you still can't afford these exorbitant prices. But I think you're going to make a follow-up point. And
I mean, my second question was, I totally agree with you that that this is not like everything that you showed is so compelling, and this is not unique to teachers, right? And so I would love to know if you have seen research or data that sort of does apples to apples that shows several different industries alongside one another, so that we can have a sense of, like, as we think about other like the police and the firefighters, but also others that are like nurses, home health workers. How do we think about all of these things? Because I think we've all seen the rising income inequality that's really distressing.
I don't know that research, but I'm happy to go back and ask Catherine, my colleague, who has looked at the research more than I have, if she's looked at the numbers in other industries. I'm sure it's very similar, and I don't know the answer to that because we've been so focused on teachers.
I think what is unique about teaching is that it is almost identical, no matter where you teach. It's if you're a teacher, you are in a rectangular room with 22 students, whether you are west of Worcester or whether you're in Newton. And so at a certain point in your life, traveling an hour to get to Newton and then an hour in the afternoon to get home, you start to think to yourself, is this worth my time? And I will tell you that for me, I made that decision when I had children, to give up an hour, to gain back an hour and a half of my day to do the identical job in Newton that I was doing in another community.
I mean, I think, so that comment is about reflecting on the costs and what you're giving up. I think, though, one thing to note is that when you teach in a district and you are placed on the salary schedule, the number of years that you spend in that district means that you're paid at higher levels for each year. And it's very difficult. If you leave and you go to another district, you will likely start on what's called step 1, back in being a first-year teacher. Sometimes the district has provisions in their collective bargaining agreement where they will allow you to start at higher levels, or you can negotiate that, but that's not always the case. So it is you do have to think about making this transition between districts. And some states, like North Carolina, have a statewide salary schedule, and so if you move from one district to another in that state, you can keep that same salary level. But that's not the case. Massachusetts negotiates its salary schedule for each of those 385 towns. Can I just mention one other quick resource? Because another colleague is in the room, Jonathan Travers. Do you live here in Newton too? Yes, he's a Newton resident as well. See this? I bring my colleagues and friends to the events. Jonathan is the president of an organization here in Watertown that is called Education Resource Strategies. And they do a lot of really good work thinking about how districts can well use dollars in order to bring about really strong student results. So for those of you who are particularly interested in that angle, I offer ERS and Jonathan as a local resource to you. Thank you all so much for the engagement. Appreciate it.
Great. Well, yeah, thank you so much, Heather. Thanks, everyone, for mostly asking questions. We've done better. Perhaps if I were an educator, I would have better control over this group of people, but unfortunately, that's just not part of my skill set. I think that the data and quantitative analysis that Heather presented was great and very compelling, but Heather made the point, and it was wonderful to hear Ari's story, which I think speak more to Newton's progressive values. We should want to build a city where the educators who serve our community can also, if they choose, can live in our community. And I know that I don't want to live in a city that is not affordable for my children's teachers. And I know that we can change this. And if you also want to change this, I would remind you that we have an election coming up in November, and you can do your research and identify city councilors who understand the stakes of our housing crisis and who will be willing to take the action that we need to take to solve that crisis for our teachers, for nurses, cops, firefighters, the people that make the burritos at Chipotle, so we really can make a Newton for everyone, which is why we gave the organization this name. That's what we're all about. So thank you very much. Before we go, I do want to take a moment, again, to thank both Heather and Ari for sharing their time, to thank Josh Herzig-Marks and Dan for helping with the audio, and the Scandinavian Living Center for sharing the space. If you enjoyed this event and would like to hear more about our events, you can sign up with us, get on our email list. If you have been inspired by this event and would like to write an email or write a letter to the City Council, you can hit this QR code. It'll be in the email also that you'll get after the event, and let them know that you came and you would like us to solve the housing crisis to help out our teachers. So that's all we've got. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.